Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Web Platform Podcast. We're back from 2018. It's 2019. We've made it another year, more web platform things. Today, we're on episode number 180. Today, we're talking about web.dev. We are your hosts this week, Justin Ribeiro, Danny Blue, Leon Revel. Danny, Leon, you survived the holidays.
Sure did.
Just barely.
And now the bug tickets flow in, and we remember what it was like pre-holiday. I think that's the general gist of things. I feel like it's gonna be a good year. It's gonna be exciting.
Yeah. In all seriousness, I did actually, for the entire time that I took off for the holidays, I took off about 2 weeks or so. I didn't open my laptop. Like I even tried to do, it's like, oh, I'll do some open source. I'll do some NGXS stuff. And I was just like, I don't want to. I don't want to do any of that. So I didn't do anything. I read books about non-tech stuff. And
physical books on a screen.
Physical books. Physical
what
books.
happened to you, man?
Made of trees? Oh my.
It was wonderful.
That sounds wonderful. I fixed a vacuum. I felt really proud of myself from fixing a vacuum. Like, there's no analogy there. I literally fixed a vacuum. That was what happened. So
I'm proud of you for fixing a vacuum.
Thank you. Dysons are hard to work on. Very difficult. But we're not talking about Dysons and books and things. But before we introduce our guest this week, I'm going to throw it over to Leon, who's going to kick us off for the first This Week in Web in 2019 in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thanks, Justin. So even though we're not that far into January, there's so many things happening already. First of all, there's a new tool for learning JavaScript that's been created. It's called Learn JavaScript Online, and it's an interactive learning experience, and it aims to be the easiest way to learn and practice modern JavaScript fundamentals. It looks really cool, so go and check that out. A release candidate for the first production-ready version of Lit Element has been released, which is really cool. So check out the blog post to learn more about that. GitHub recently announced that you can now get unlimited free private repositories for up to 3 collaborators. So that's pretty cool. And there's also been a series of fix releases for Webpack, Vue, and Stencil. So if you're following any of those projects, go and check out the release notes to find out what fixes are in those particular releases. And there's also been a new feature release for Rollup too. So check out the changelog to find out what's in that particular release as well. So already loads and loads of stuff happening this year. And finally, the awesome folks who are organizing the React Amsterdam conference this year, they've given us a free ticket to give out to one of our listeners. So the React Amsterdam conference is the biggest React conference worldwide, and it's happening on the 10th to the 12th of April this year. There's 2 tracks. There's like a general track and a React Native track, and there's over 25 speakers from all over the world. So if you'd like to win a ticket to this awesome conference, all you need to do is send us an email to hi@thewebplatformpodcast.com with the magic word Shadow DOM as the subject. And then at the end of January, we'll randomly select a winner to receive this awesome free ticket to this really cool conference. So don't miss out and send us that email. So that's everything from me for This Week in Web. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. Yeah, it's cool. You know, it always amazes me that so many releases happen at the beginning of the year, because I always feel that I was very unproductive during the holidays, and rightfully so. You can't write code all the time. You go crazy that way. And it's cool if you want a React ticket, which I think it's really funny that the magic word is Shadow DOM. So kudos to, I know you guys were talking about that in the channel the other day. I think it's hilarious. So do send us that email. But we're not talking about Shadow DOM today, though we have spoken about Shadow DOM with our guest this week and previous episodes of things. Rob Dodson, welcome back to the show, buddy.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Rob, for people out there who don't know you, you've been around the web for a long time. You know, you've been on the show before. You've worked on many other things. What are you working on these days?
So right now, my team, so I'm on the Chrome developer relations team, and our group is working on a new site called web.dev, which we just launched at Chrome Dev Summit. Took a little break for the holidays to let everyone kind of like recoup. But we have a lot of stuff that we want to do on that site this year in 2019. So that's kind of where my focus is at right now.
And you've kind of worked on the wide span of what I consider the cool things of the web. You've worked on web components. You've worked on accessibility. You've been a writer, a speaker. You've worked on Chrome. You've been sort of all over the entire span that could be the web. From a are you looking forward to 2019? Because I feel like 2019, this is the year of the web. I said this last year in 2018, and it turned out correct. So I'm predicting it again. Do you feel 2019 is going to be a good year for the web?
Yeah, I do. I'm actually like pretty into and fascinated by all of the tools that are out there right now. Lately, I've been looking at like Next.js a lot, which I think is super neat. But yeah, I just feel like kind of feels like everyone's sort of firing on all cylinders, right? While there are a lot of tools that people could choose to learn, and that's always been a little bit of a challenge, it is exciting, right? Seeing that there is so much like activity and like life in the community. I almost prefer it this way than something that would feel like stagnation, right? So yeah, I think 2019 there's gonna be a lot of stuff happening.
And hopefully some of that stuff gets collected at web.dev, which, as you mentioned, got released at Chrome Dev Summit. There's been a lot of content developments, it seems like, over last year. You've got sort of the MDM board coming together, so where we're going to sort of consolidate helpful sort of platform documentation. Obviously, developers.google.com/web was a source of continuous articles every month for things. And now web.dev sort of exists to sort of bring a whole bunch of those things together. So sort of what's the vision for web.dev as sort of 2019 rolls around?
Yeah, so that's a good question, right? Because you already listed a few other similar sites. So like to back up a little bit to sort of tell the origin story of it, everyone on my team writes documentation for developers.google.com/web. And those docs are kind of split into two types. We write guidance, sort of. We just call them guides, really. And that's like if I'm trying to teach you almost like a whole topic, like soup to nuts. And then the other thing we do is we just call them updates, but they're more like blog posts, right? It's like if I want to talk about a cool new WebAssembly feature, and maybe it's like still baking, right? So it's not at the point yet where we want to like enshrine it in like a super official guide. It's just like, hey, this thing is happening and it's really neat, and like folks should play around with it. All right, so those are kind of the two content types that we're working with. In addition to that, we also create a lot of tools, in particular things like Lighthouse. And one of the things that's always kind of stuck with me is that, ultimately our job with writing these guides and these blog posts and everything is we want to see like a measurable improvement on the web in terms of user experience, right? We want websites to feel faster. We want them to be more accessible to more users and things like that. But it's really hard to actually connect the fact that, I wrote some guide and the web got faster, right? Like I can write a guide and I can see that a certain number of people have read that guide, right? Just looking at like Google Analytics. But it doesn't tell me whether anyone actually shipped better code or like improved their site. It's just sort of like, hey, this number of eyeballs looked at this thing, right? And that's one of the things that's always kind of like stuck in my craw as a developer advocate, right? Is I can do all this stuff, but I really can't prove that the web got better because of it. And so a while back, myself and Megan Kearney, who also is on the team and is sort of the co-lead of web.dev with me, we got to talking about this and we were like, we have these great tools like Lighthouse and we have these guides over here. And it would be really awesome if there was a way for someone to just come to a site and put in their URL and have us like remember it maybe and help sort of track it over time for them and run tools like Lighthouse on their behalf and then show them the guides that say, oh, okay, we noticed that you're shipping like images that are larger than you need to. Here's some guidance on how to fix that. Maybe, use like WebP or something like that. And then we should be able to, if we're sort of tracking their site over time, we should be able to verify that at some point they looked at the guide, they came back, they fixed the issue, and their scores improved, right? And so now we're creating that linkage between our guidance and our tooling. And if we see that, for instance, users, we tell them, hey, you have this issue, and then they go and they look at the guide and they don't fix the issue, that also tells us something. That tells us that like the guides that we're writing are maybe not as effective as they could be. Or maybe we're saying, hey, this is a problem, and users are like, I don't really think it's that big of a problem, right? So the whole idea around web.dev is to help us connect our tools to our guidance and just have kind of like a more, I don't know, like meaningful understanding of the content that we're creating, and hopefully it's more effective for developers as a result of that. When you look at something like MDN, for instance, we are not trying to like replace what something like MDN does. And in fact, a number of places on web.dev, we link to MDN. I tend to think of it more as like MDN is this amazing resource for like reference. Like I often use it for like API reference and things like that, where I want to know, okay, what is the exact method on this object? What does that method do? Web.dev to me is much more of a sort of like integrated tooling docs thing, right? It's supposed to be like a place where you can build a little bit of a profile, and it can kind of help you out over time as you're optimizing and improving the thing that you're working on.
Yeah, it strikes me that it's very hard as someone who spent pretty much all of December writing reports around performance regressions for people. It is hard to sort of delineate metric to potential solution, or at least the guide to what that potential solution is. Do you see, so obviously the tooling only gives you so many of these things. Do you see that web.dev sort of will continue to be that bridge for sort of a wide range of tooling that continues to sort of roll out, obviously, as things like Lighthouse get new features, or various things within Chrome or other browsers, where as opposed to saying, you know what, we're going to build yet another tool? Like, because it strikes me that web.dev seems like a really nice play, an overview holder of the things that you, like you said, want to track over time, but not necessarily the end all be all for sussing things out. It should be in terms that guide to get you to the next stage of, this is important, this is how you kind of fix it, but you're still going to have to write some code on your side of life.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few things there. I think that when I think of the tooling integration, I think of it almost like, the site itself is there to help knit together some of the tooling story, because there are a lot of tools, right? And part of the battle is just discovering them. So if I have one place that I can go that is saying, okay, cool, like I can show you your Lighthouse score here, and maybe, in the future, other integrations as well, right? Like maybe, again, I shouldn't make like any promises, so don't, hold me to this, but it's like, if we could integrate things like analytics, right? So we could actually even like do correlations. We could say, hey, we saw here that your Lighthouse score went down on this day, and by the way, these pages, like, time on page went down that day as well, right? So if we can start to build those sorts of relationships, I think that would be really cool. And then, yeah, it's like you have a tool that tells you, oh, hey, this thing is bad or slow or whatever, but then understanding how to fix that is pretty challenging. And one of the other things that we saw was a lot of the documentation out there will say, okay, this thing is slow. And then the thing that it points you to as like guidance on how to fix that is often like too high level and too abstract, right? So it might say, oh yeah, just like do this with your JavaScript bundle. And you're like, yeah, but like I'm like a WordPress developer, right? Like I don't touch the JavaScript bundle in the way that you think I do, right? So I think it's really important to take into consideration the platform that the developer is building on. And so one of the other things that I would really like to do, and we're starting to explore this, is can our tools actually figure out the platform, right? Can it be like, okay, well, I can tell that you're actually on WordPress. So rather than giving you very broad, very generic guidance about what to do with your JS bundle, I can point you to something that's a little bit more specific to WordPress itself, right? So I think that would be really cool. And then sort of the last part of that is we want these to be very interactive docs as well. So one of the things we're experimenting with is embedding like glitch little editors throughout the experience. So when we're telling you how to fix something, we're not doing it in the abstract, but we're actually showing you and like giving you the opportunity to say like, okay, cool, we've set up Express, or maybe we've like set up WordPress on glitch for you, and like here is what the fix will do, or let's walk through that fix together. Because I personally get really frustrated when something's like, yeah, it just sort of like hand waves. It's like, yeah, go break up your bundle. And I'm like, oh, that's hard. I got to go click like a million more links to figure out how to do that.
There is, I feel like there is that gap where not understanding the developer sort of world is troublesome for a lot of tooling today. I see it on a near daily basis at this point where, hey, I ran the tool, but the guidance it gives me is next to useless to me. I feel like that's a major thing that we continuously have to work towards overcoming. And I realize it's very difficult. I think that there's no easy solution for this. Obviously, if it was easy, we'd already have these sorts of things built out. But we definitely, I feel like sometimes we leave developers behind in that regard, where, hey, don't worry, it's just because of this. And oh, look at your main thread performance. And it's obviously in the trace. And most people can't read those things. That's a skill that I think we have to develop in more developers, but also understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, I agree. It's like really specialized understanding to like, for someone to just like give you a trace and be like, yeah, like figure it out. And you're like, all I see are like colored stacked bar or area graphs. Like, and why does that one have diagonal lines and that one doesn't? Like, it's, yeah, like the tooling is good. The forensic tooling is really good, but it also just sort of assumes that the person knows how to use those forensic tools. And the other part of this too is it also assumes that the person knows that like to even break out the tools in the first place, right? Like that, because the website may feel fine to them. And so if my website feels fine, then I don't really have any inclination to just be like, let me open my tools now and start really, really like poking around here because, I have other things that I could be working on. So one of the things that developers have told us in the past is like, I just wish that like the browser or something could like give me a heads up when I'm starting to trend in the wrong direction. So rather than me having to like proactively go and open dev tools and start profiling, it could maybe like be doing some of that behind the scenes and then just be like, hey, FYI, like sort of passively, like there are some issues here that you could address at some point if you would like to, and here's the guidance on how to do that.
Yeah, I definitely think, it's funny too, because a lot of times when I see metrics come out from folks, when they've finally discovered a tool, and it doesn't matter what tool it is, sometimes that tool's set up incorrectly, right? Because again, like you said, they don't necessarily feel it because maybe they're on a workstation, maybe they're on something high power, they're close to that endpoint where things are being served out of. They don't see the actual user experience that is sort of the determining factor if people are going to use their applications or their websites or whatever. And then they look at the metrics, and then the metrics are like, oh, these numbers look great because, my load time was 4.5 seconds. And you're going, your load time wasn't actually 4.5 seconds. That's when the first ping had, because the ping was, your metric is now set up, but incorrect. And then you end up with that, well, wait, why? Right. And I feel like web.dev's content tie-in with those toolings will sort of help bridge that gap. Would that be a safe assumption over time, at least?
Yeah, that's definitely the hope, is that we're definitely not there yet, but the hope is that you'll be able to go in, put in, some of the URLs for your site that you think are really meaningful, and then web.dev will sort of passively monitor them for you and help point out opportunities and point you at the right documentation. Probably phase one, which is the one that we're currently in, is it'll be like it'll still be a little bit like broad stroke, in the sense that it'll be like, your JS bundle is a little too big and here's some guides on how to do code splitting. And then as we start to develop the ability to like understand your platform better, right, that you're on WordPress or Magento or you're on this CDN or whatever, like then we can start to give you even more fine-grained guidance to fix those issues. And like part of this, I think, is, from my perspective, it's also like having empathy for the developer and what it's like to be building these things. And I feel like personally, when I feel like I'm working on a project and I really, really understand what we're building and I understand the domain, right? Like I feel like I'm pretty decent at building like UI elements. So if I'm on a project and all I'm really doing is building like UI widgets and things like that, it's a very straightforward site. then I'll often take the time to like do a whole bunch of checking on other devices and everything, because I'm not like super stressed out about work. Whereas when I'm working on a project that is really stressing me out because the domain is very new to me and I feel like I'm kind of struggling and I'm just trying to like get something out the door, I feel like in those scenarios, you're probably less inclined to do like loads of like additional mobile testing because you're just trying to get something to work, right? You're just trying to like hit some deadline. And so where possible, when the tools can actually be sort of, carrying some of that burden for you, I think that's really beneficial. And ultimately, like that's kind of where I want to get to with this.
See, you said that web.dev can kind of do some of that analysis like passive. Could you just talk a little bit as to exactly how that works? Is it like how often does it run those tests again and all those other kind of things?
Yeah, so we launched with this feature and we recently turned it off, but I can talk through it a little bit. So when we launched web.dev, you put in your URL. There's a sign-in button, so you have to be signed in to do this particular step. If you're not signed in, you can just put in a URL and it'll run sort of like a one-off check of your site using Lighthouse, and it'll give you a sort of a to-do list of things to fix. If you are signed in, then initially what it would do is it would actually audit your site once a day, and we have a little time series chart that it creates for you, and it just shows you how you're doing in all the different categories over time. We turned that feature off because we started basically like DDoSing the service, right? Because like we launched it at CDS, and like a million people sign in, they put in a lot of URLs, right? And then we were like, okay, we got to figure out how to scale this a little bit better. So in the near term, we've turned off the like automatic auditing, and what it does now is if you're signed in, when you have your URL in, and if you click Run Audit, that is when it'll like update your time series for you. So it's not doing it automatically. It's just whenever you go in and push the button again. So for instance, recently I updated my theme for my blog, and I hadn't run the service since like December 12th. And I ran it again like literally yesterday. So that's like the next node on my time series is like almost a month apart. But that works well because like nothing had really changed up until that point. And now I see that like, oh yes, this new theme has had effects on my score. Ultimately though, I think what we'd like to do is have it be automatic, or maybe like opt in for it to be automatic, something like that. And probably we'd space the cadence out a little bit more. So it's running like once a week, not once a day, because I don't know if that's like super useful information to see that like it's the same as yesterday if you didn't change anything. But yeah, like that's kind of like the near-term thing we want to do there, is we want to have, whether it be opt-in or not, some way for it to automatically be just sort of passively checking your site with Lighthouse, and then also letting folks opt into notifications, be that like push notification in the browser or an email or something that's like, hey, FYI, I noticed that like your accessibility score fell by 20 points or something.
Cool.
So
that sounds super awesome.
Yeah, we're not there yet, but that's where we want to get.
Nice. Yeah, that'd be really useful, I think, because best practices would dictate that once you've made changes to your site, you should run some, you could run Lighthouse or whatever just to double check that your recent changes haven't negatively impacted your score or whatever. But I suppose the situations where maybe let's say you've got user generated content on your site, and there's a situation where you're not easily able to test, and then after users have generated a certain amount of content on your site, you then start slowing down, which is negatively impacting the Lighthouse score and all the other things. So it would be really neat to have a service kind of running in the background that's just going to give you an alert if something like that has happened without you noticing. So that sounds really cool. Just for those who are familiar with Lighthouse, have used it before, are there any differences with the kind of report you get from running it from web.dev, or is it basically the same kind of output?
It's pretty similar. I think the primary difference is there can be some delta in the performance scores because it is running from a hosted service versus you running it locally. I don't think they're like super noticeable, but I think one thing that has cropped up a lot is people will adjust their settings in dev tools. So some people will like turn throttling off and then be like, how come my performance score is bad? And it's like, well, because you turn throttling off locally. So like, it seems like it's really fast locally. So yeah, I think that one of the things we wanted to do is better explain the settings that are on the site right now. So people just like understand, okay, that's how that maps to dev tools, and talk through like, where there might be potential like latency issues or something associated with the fact that it's a hosted service. But in general, they should map pretty closely. And so I think if you're already familiar with dev tools, then it's not going to be like a profoundly different experience. With the exception of if you want to sign in, you will be able to do those time series charts. But what we found that's actually been really interesting is there's a lot of people that are using this tool for the first time, like essentially using Lighthouse for the first time, because I think it has a bit of a discoverability problem within DevTools itself. And I think there's a lot of folks who are also not entirely comfortable like opening up DevTools and poking around in there. So though this wasn't intentional, one of the sort of interesting like emergent things we saw was there were all these people writing about the tool who had clearly never used Lighthouse before. And I think this is more of like the SEO type crowd. But that's, I mean, in my opinion, that's really interesting because there's a lot of topics that crowd is now getting exposed to or looking at a little bit more closely that they were not before, in particular accessibility. I don't know if PageSpeed Insights, I don't think it has any sort of like accessibility stuff. So it's cool seeing that group now factor that into their considerations or people who just, weren't comfortable with DevTools before factoring these things into what they're working on.
Yeah, especially if the goal is about, educating more people about the kind of things that can slow down sites and what you can do to improve those things, and having that information kind of reach a new type of audience is amazing. Really cool.
So I'm curious about a couple things. So there seem to be there are two main links on the web.dev website. There's learn and there's measure. We've talked about measuring a lot. We've been talking about Lighthouse and things like that, and delivering actionable feedback on your site that you can be able to handle. But then there's also there's a bunch of other I don't know, like core tenets or pillars that it lists out for things that it's trying to teach. There's being fast load times, network resilience, safe and secure, easily discoverable, installable, and accessible to all. So I guess not really which are the most important. Like fast load times is I think is a little bit easier to understand because you want your website to load fast. Must go faster is something that a lot of folks have been saying for the last, especially for the last couple of years. It's all over the place in 2018. So I think a lot of folks are familiar right off the bat with what that is and what you're trying to teach. I was curious if you could go through some of the others and try to maybe give like a blurb of the type of thing that you're trying to cover under those different sections, especially with things people might not be as familiar with. I think network resilience is a good place to start on that.
Yeah. So and to talk about just that section in general a little bit, we there's like a few key areas that I think the developer relations team really cares about, right? Like the surface area of the web is gigantic. So we always have to pick a few areas that we really want to push on. And that's why we chose those 6. And yeah, pillars, principles, like whatever you want to call them, right? Those are the things that I think if you were to go to the DevRel team and have them list, like, what are the things that you think in general we always need to be improving on the web? It would probably be those 6 things. And yeah, so they're sort of organized into, I think I like to think of them as being organized into, the like a book apart books that are sort of these like short little books on like, very, very focused on like one topic of like, engineering or design or something like that. So I try to think of them like that. And yeah, to walk through the different topics, right? Obviously, performance is performance. So that's what the fast section is all about. Reliability or network resilience, that one is really about making sure that if a user is on a spotty mobile connection, that they're having a consistent experience. Again, this is one of those things that like, as a developer, it's so easy to, you're usually working on Wi-Fi or plugged into Ethernet, right? It's so easy to forget that things can hang, things can take a while, that in sort of this modern era, we take our technology with us, right, on our phone, and we're always going in and out of like, subway tunnels or like, elevators or whatever, right? And so you don't want things to just drop. So we want people to just kind of understand the concept of resilience, why we think it's important, and then what are some of the ways that you can build it into your application. For security, I feel like this is a really interesting area because I feel like along with accessibility, security is probably one of the areas that most developers don't have a great understanding of, myself included, right? I know it's important, but if you were to ask me to like lock down a website or something, I would need to probably Google that or watch some talks. I don't like off the top of my head know how to like, prevent all the attacks in the world. And so that's one of those areas where we were like, we just know that we need to improve this, especially as technology is just increasingly important in people's lives, and privacy and things like that matter so much to users. Like making sure that data is safe and secure is really important. So Mariko on our team has been taking on that topic area and trying to write it from the perspective of like sort of assuming that the audience is not super deeply familiar with security. So writing it from a first principles and sort of like building your knowledge up from their narrative. Discoverability, right? That's all about essentially SEO, or that I think related to performance, like make it index better is the other thing that you just always want to be pushing on. Accessibility, very near and dear to my heart, just making sure that every single person has the ability to access the content or information on your site. It's a huge domain, right? It involves engineering and design and content strategy, right? So I've also tried to write that one in sort of like a narrative structure, assuming that the audience is just not super, I mean, they've probably heard the term before, but they don't really know like everything about accessibility. And finally, installability. We're kind of pushing on that now because we're starting to see more and more usage of PWAs. And we just think it's going to continue to be important in the years ahead, right? And so we want to make sure that if people want to make their application installable, they have like one place they can go to sort of quickly figure out how to do that. Each of these sections I would describe as sort of work in progress. Like all of them are probably telling anywhere from 60 to 80% of the story right now, but we have a lot more work to do to like fill out all of those narratives, I think.
And do you think that the Lighthouse report that developers have access to for their sites helps answer or helps identify problems in all of those different areas at the moment?
Yeah, it should. So we have mappings from Lighthouse to at least like a few guides in each of those topic areas. There is a little bit of like a difference, right? Like Lighthouse has slightly different categorization than those principles that we're showing there. Like Lighthouse has a category just called best practices, which includes all sorts of things related to either like SEO, accessibility, or security, right? So, we have some Lighthouse categories that our measure tool is using that sort of point to different guide sections. But yeah, like I see there being a relationship between the two. Mentally, I've started to think of them like a little bit differently, where I'm thinking of starting to like tease out more of the Lighthouse specific stuff and maybe even like move that more into the measure section of the site itself, and then have the stuff on Learn be even more like narrative focused. Again, looking at like the security and accessibility sections. So if someone's coming in and they're like, hey, I know performance is important, but I need like a conceptual overview of this thing. Like maybe having the fast section be kind of more oriented towards that and less exclusively just like, hey, fix this thing, fix this thing, fix this thing, like helping someone kind of get their first principles and their bearings.
So regarding the content that's on the site at the moment, is there any way or any desire for this content to change in the terms of like community contributions, or is there any other way that people can contribute to help basically improve and extend the site?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that. I think the first part, which is really, really, really important to me, is just getting feedback from folks. whether they want to like ping me directly on Twitter or file issues on the GitHub repo, which is at github.com/Google Chrome/web.dev. I'm not the world's greatest designer or anything, but I've been trying to help lead the content strategy and design for this site. And so a lot of that is, we build something, we kind of put it out there, and then I'm looking for the feedback from the community for folks to be like, I'm finding aspects of this helpful, but these parts could be improved, to figure out, how we shape it and where we go next. So getting feedback from folks, even if they're, if they don't feel like it's a bug per se, but going to GitHub and being like, I was trying to go through this guide and I just found like the layout or the organization weird. Like it's just not doing it for me. It's not clicking. And examples of things that they do think, clicks better with them. I'm super interested in that stuff. The other side is, if you see bugs on the site, or you are reading an article and you're like, I don't know if that's like 100% accurate what was just said there. And also on GitHub, that's where all of our written content lives. So you can go there and you can file issues. You can do pull requests to patch up the guides and the code labs that are currently on the site. The one thing to note is that right now, at least, all of the actual like infrastructure, like the server for the site and like the JavaScript that's powering the front end, currently lives in like internal Google source control. So those parts are not accessible to developers to like hack on. Though there is like a preview server that we built with Puppeteer. So if you are kind of like messing around on the site, you're like changing an article or something, you can preview it locally. But yeah, it was like corporate policy that stuff needs to stay internal, at least for now. And one of the things I'm working on right now is figuring out how we can open source even more of it, so folks could just like hack on the whole experience. But yeah, the last thing I should say is, if folks are actually interested in writing an article on the site, which would be pretty cool, I think the recommendation there would be to start with just like a GitHub issue, to be like, hey, I wanted to write a post on this particular thing. Here's what I want to say roughly in it. Here is some examples of my previous work. And then I think from there, we could probably have like an offline discussion to like really like, sort through if that's cool. And then, try and actually land some of that content. I think it'd be really cool to get to the point where we can take community contributions. I don't know if we've like really done it much before on developers.google.com/web. And I think that's mainly, not because we didn't want it, but mainly because I don't think we have, to be honest, like a fully baked process to do it. But I mean, I feel like the way that those things get baked is you try it, and you figure it out. So yeah, if people do want to give that a shot, you can definitely, try it.
I think that's really, really cool, because especially if you're wanting to get kind of more specific around the kind of tools and the kind of platform that people are delivering their sites on. Of course, there's a lot of content to cover there, from just like the different frameworks and the different bundling mechanisms to the different platforms, like you mentioned, like WordPress and all those others. And obviously, there's a lot of experts out there that cover all these different kind of areas. So, kind of pulling together with more and more resources and knowledge would be really good.
Yeah, I should mention there too, like one of the things that I'm interested in is how much of the content needs to be on our site versus being on those platform sites, right? Like, I don't think we want to have the combinatorial explosion of trying to have like guidance for every platform necessarily. It may ultimately make more sense for that stuff to be written and maintained in like the canonical, WordPress docs or Shopify docs or whatever, right? But even then, I think we'd be interested in like working with the folks to not only author that stuff and figure out where's the best place for it to live, but also to figure out then how does that integrate with tooling as well. So like, how do we essentially connect, okay, Lighthouse has this like magical WordPress audit now, and there's this WordPress doc, cool, let's make sure we create that linkage so that everyone can discover it in their web.dev profile.
So that actually prompts another question from me about, so you talked about trying to give more specific information or guide people to more specific information. So wherever that is, so like you said, WordPress docs or something like that. Is there an attempt or any way that you would be able to help identify, or maybe even allow somebody to self-identify like how their website is built, saying like, oh, I built this with Vue, so that you all know it's like, okay, well, that you could actually point them specifically to even like specific parts of the Vue Vue.js documentation or something like that. Is that something else that you're looking into, or can it do it already?
We're not. I think Lighthouse can maybe do some of these things already, and I think they're working on gaining more insight and being able to identify things. Right, like some stuff I don't think we can. Right, we can't identify that you used Gulp versus Grunt as like a build tool. We may be able to identify different front-end frameworks. We may be able to identify different like back-end things like WordPress or whatever CMS you're on. We have talked about the idea of just letting the user just straight up be like, I built this with this, right? So I used Vue, so just give me the Vue guidance. We haven't implemented that yet, but yeah, I mean that's a great idea, and that honestly maybe that is like a better first step while we're still working out how to do the the machine guidance, where it's like figuring it out based on what you're giving it, right? You just tell it. But yeah, we're in the 2019 planning phase right now, so I will bring that up and be like, hey, like what should we do here?
Well, because I think you should keep mentioning actionable guidance on this stuff, and I mean it seems like the more specific you can get to what the developer, what tools the developer are using, it seems like maybe the guidance could be very specifically tailored, especially now when, for example, if you're using Vue, you're probably using the Vue CLI as your build tool. So that, like there are things like that that you can kind of infer based off of small amounts of information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting space because it's like you want to be able to build these linkages. There's always going to be a bit of a natural tension of making sure that those linkages don't bit rot, right? And that like, that article doesn't 404 someday. Or that, for instance, like Vue doesn't want to build their own performance tool and just sort of tell everyone to use that instead. So yeah, it's a really interesting sort of problem to work on, frankly. It's kind of one of the things that I essentially never stop thinking about now that I'm working on this thing, because I'm just like, you want to do this, but the world's constantly moving underneath you. So you got to figure out how to build a platform that is relatively stable on top of that.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, having answered tickets on the Lighthouse repo about folks who run audits and then don't understand what those audits come back from, and then you go look at the URL they've had, and then you basically become a detective as to, okay, well, you're using Vue in development mode, don't do this. Here's docs that show you how your config should be configured, yada, yada, yada. I mean, you really get into the weeds is the problem, is that, because again, the metrics and the tooling will always surface the end result of that thing, but trying to figure out the entire chain of those things is tough. Some of that stuff doesn't get stamped though. I know, like library versions, for instance, there was some work around that and the fingerprinting of those things, so that you should probably update this because this one is older and has a CVE on against it for vulnerability and whatnot. But yeah, it is a tough question. Like, where do you put those things? Where do people learn about the platform they're using, right? Is that, Canonical Docs somewhere else? Is that Platform Docs? From my standpoint, it's already hard enough. Like, it'd be great to have the singular clearinghouse of all things. Like, everything lives on web.dev. Everyone contribute there. But I also know how unrealistic that sounds in my head. Just generally.
Even if it's just like providing enough information so people can understand where to go to next and what to look for in their own ecosystem. So it says, you're shipping too much JavaScript, so you need to split your bundle. Like, having enough information about what that thing actually means, so then that if they're using Nuxt or Vue or React or Angular or whatever, that they know what specific part of the documentation to go and read to help understand how they would do that in their particular ecosystem. So I think stuff like that can really help. But yeah, like solving it kind of more specifically, I think is very hard, like you said.
It's just hard to collect that stuff into an order that does not get out of hand. Because again, I spent a lot of time doing this last couple of months of just writing reports and documentation around stuff of this nature for other folks who were struggling with various issues at around the world. Because again, you end up with those gaps of, oh, it works great on my machine, but it doesn't. Then you go into that weeds area of, well,
Yeah.
your integration point was X. Here's the documentation for these things. And here's why this works. And then you start to break it out because you end up with that scenario. Well, I don't understand what a bundle is. Okay, well, this is what a bundle is. Okay, well, I don't understand what that has to do with 300 files I loaded in JavaScript. Okay,
Yeah.
well, then the problem is you continuously transverse up to find the point in time where that's where the skill level is. And I think that is a continuous challenge for any set of documentation that tries to bridge gaps, is that you're looking for the middle, but you also have the outliers of your histogram of, well, wait, am I going to make more victories if I track down more of this, not even the advanced stuff, the beginning stuff. Hey, if you do these things first, you'll get much more, and you'll move those people in the curve. Like, I think that's hard, just generally.
Yeah, that's why we want, again, to have some of, I think, more of the like narrative end-to-end guidance in the learn section that can give people, again, I think of it like, I want it to be like a tiny bookshelf with very focused books that let you sort of choose the level that you want to be at. So, beginner, intermediate, advanced on performance, right? So there'd be a little booklet there. You could pop that out if you need to understand that domain better. And then on the other side of the site, there's literally this tool with these audits, and the audits are, like you were kind of mentioning, they're very specific. They're like, break up your bundle size. And so then you're like, I don't know what a bundle is. And it's like, okay, let's go to the beginner performance little e-booklet and sort of like understand what that really means, right? And then you can come back and keep working on those audits. So there would be a bit of a relationship, sort of jumping back and forth there. One thing that is really tricky to figure out, though, is there's sort of like a never-ending list of JavaScript frameworks and platforms and things like that. And so, we want to give specific guidance, but we also don't want to be in a position where it feels like we're picking favorites. And that's a really challenging problem to work through as well, right? Like, we all know that React is super popular and everything, and Angular is really popular and stuff. So if we only provide specific guidance for React and Angular, is that to the detriment of other libraries and frameworks? And I really don't know. Like, I don't know the right answer there. I do think that people would appreciate having more specific guidance that is tailored to their framework. But I don't want people to feel like we've like excluded folks. And so that's one of the things we're definitely thinking a lot about this year.
I see, and I think that's a very good point, Rob, is that when we talk about the frameworks that we presume, because of that's where all the chatter is, right, around your Reacts and Angulars of the world and whatnot, my fear always is, are we leaving out the subset of developers who don't get to use our new fancy stuff because they can use the tools, but they don't necessarily have the same infra that we often think that they do? So and again, it varies so much within different organizations and the way they work. And you've got this old jQuery thing with a backbone router and all these pieces where they still want the performance gains, but they're going, well, maybe performance only accounts for these new things. And like, from my standpoint, talking to a lot of those folks, I constantly have to remind them, it's not just about the thing that you saw on site, on the orange site yesterday. That's not the entire world. Your world is this working tool you've had for 10 years. Like, you can make it faster. Like, there is gaps to build in there. And I don't like you, I don't want to see people left behind in that. Well, it's only for other people who are advanced. We're never going to get there because ginormous code base, slow moving corporation, yada, yada, yada.
Yep. Yeah. So we may test the waters in the near term future of trying to do some framework specific guidance. But again, that's one of those areas where I'm going to want a lot of feedback from folks who are like, yeah, this is cool, and I don't mind that it doesn't, have other content. Or if folks are like, hey, like, I'm annoyed that it doesn't have, jQuery or something, like, I want to know that, right? I want to just get people's perspective on that. Even if, I don't know, people who listen to this, if they want to like tweet at me afterwards, their thoughts on that idea. Because yeah, it's a hard decision to make, right? I think the end goal is noble, but we want to make sure that the way we get there doesn't end up having unintended consequences or side effects.
Well, it's also the same thing about building any software, right? Like you have finite time and resources, and you have to decide where to spend those time and resources. And so if there's, so if it's beneficial to do one thing, I'm sure you all will try to do it. If it's not worth the time, then you won't.
I have unlimited time, Danny. I have unlimited time. I just build everything all the time, every scenario, just every branch.
Dear listeners, if you're having trouble getting a good Lighthouse score, call Justin Ribeiro on 650.
Oh, gee, yeah, that's the way to go. Yeah, let's put that number out there. It's just,
I mean, that's what I
do. Brilliant. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I could talk about this stuff forever. But there's just one last question I'd like to ask, which is: so you already mentioned a few things, Rob, stuff that you'd like to eventually be able to do, if possible, on web.dev. Are there any other kind of ambitions you've got, or any other cool features that you'd like to investigate, think about adding?
I think in the near term, the most important thing for me is kind of like improving the content that's on the site right now and making it easier to navigate. I think that one of the things that we don't quite have is like really good end-to-end tutorials, like interactive tutorials. We have these things that we call code labs right now. They're sort of like one-off, and I don't know, I want someone to be able to like go through a tutorial and then at the very end, like hit a deploy button. We use Glitch. Glitch does have deployments for Firebase and things like that built in. So I think that would be really, really cool, like showing you how to build your first Firebase app, and then at the very end, you just like hit a button, literally like right there on the site, and it goes live, and it gets automatically added, like the URL automatically gets added to your profile for the measure page. We want to flesh out the user profile a lot more. Due to like time constraints, it's basically just like a sign-in button, and then it shows you some time series graphs. But I want that to feel like a place where someone can, put in a little bit of their personality. And then, yeah, as we were talking before about like having the tool do sort of passive monitoring, I think one of the other things I forgot to mention is like the potential for it to be like a CI hook, so that when you do push new changes, it just goes ahead and it's essentially running Lighthouse CI on your behalf. And if it notices something wrong, it sends you a link to a guide on web.dev. And then finally, we're looking for like more tools integration. So we're talking to other tooling teams within Google. I don't know if anything will come of that, but I think it would be really cool to start to have more tools in there and actually figure out ways to like knit them together in one place, so you have more of a holistic understanding of what's going on with your site versus there's separate tools, they live in separate domains, and you kind of just got to go like use them individually and mentally like knit it all together. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff there, a lot of like ambitious things we want to do. And yeah, we'll see what gets done in 2019, I guess.
Awesome. A lot of that sounds really, really cool. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens, and looking forward to playing around with the site more for sure.
Well, we're just about out of time now. Rob, if people want to find you, Twitter, yes? They just tweet at you consistently all the time?
Yeah, I'm Rob_Dodson, Dodson on Twitter. The underscore is important. So yeah. The other person who has my same name on Twitter posts a lot of very like questionable stuff.
I've not seen this. I'm looking right now.
I've seen some pretty rough stuff on there. Sorry, I realize now everybody is going to go look at that. But yeah, the underscore is important. Yeah, that's probably the best way to reach me on the Twitters.
And then we'll make sure to put that in the show notes as well as the repo. So if you find issues or have suggestions for web.dev, you'll be able to do that on GitHub as well. Rob, thank you so much for coming on the show again. We always appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all for having me.
Leon, Danny, closing thoughts before we round out episode number 180 of the Web Platform Podcast.
Just that I'm looking forward to 2019. We've got some great shows lined up. I'm looking forward to getting stuck in.
I bought a little I bought a little drone, so I think I'm a drone person now.
Fantastic. I have no response to that. I was not expecting that off the cuff. All right. Well, Danny, I hope to see you controlling that drone with the web here very shortly. Then let's get that project rolled out.
Okay.
And with that, we're going to wrap up episode number 180 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today, we've been talking with Rob Dodson about web.dev, the latest entrant in all things measuring and learning about how to make the web more performant and better for you and your users. Tune in next week when we talk more things web, more things platform. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your week.